Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out my Protection Paladin class guide for Shadowlands Patch 9.1. No big preamble this time, we'll just get right into it, but first, why don't you give me a like and subscribe? Slap that like button if you like me being quick about it. Now let's start with what's changed for Protection Paladin in patch 9.1, and there's almost nothing here. The debuff from Blessing of Winter for Night Fae Paladin can hit multiple targets at once, and honestly I didn't realize that was already the case, because no one plays Night Fae Paladin, and no one should play Night Fae Paladin. So any more time spent on that would just be a waste. Let's move on. And let's get started with Covenants. Prot Pallies have two competitive Covenant choices, and which one you prefer really comes down to the kind of content that you prefer to play. I'll start by saying that Night Fae and Llarold are both really weak, and you probably shouldn't ever play either of them. Maybe in a future patch, but honestly I think they would need complete redesigns to ever be serious contenders. Let's start with Venthyr, which is the better raid Covenant. Ashen Hallow is one of the best DPS cooldowns in the entire game, probably the number one. It's a massive burst damage and healing skill that's great in both AoE and single target. It just really boosts your damage to infinity and beyond. And again, it's a great raid healing cooldown when things are, very sketchy, and Ashen Hallow can keep the raid going even when the healers are struggling. Of course, the big downside to it is that it has such a long cooldown. 4 minutes is an eternity. And while Ashen is really good at maximizing your damage in raids for those huge burst windows, that's 3 minutes and 30 seconds at a time where it's not going to be able to do anything. Again, not a problem in raids. That's very much something you can plan and play around. For Mythic Plus, it really alters the way you want to pull packs and time all of your other offensive and defensive cooldowns. Essentially, you'll want to have Wings and Ashen overlap with each other, and if you're talented into Seraphim, you'll want to have that with both of them up at the same time as well. When your cooldowns are all up in a Mythic Plus, you're going to want to pull big and obliterate everything, and when they're not, you need to be more cautious. Generally speaking, this means you'll want to start every dungeon that you can off with a giant pull, Ashen Hallow, Wings, and if you're running it, Seraphim, probably won't be. And then try to have it up for each boss or each particularly nasty group of trash that you can pull together into it. If you can fit any extra casts in between, the big opener and the bosses, that's great. But you kind of want to think of it like Bloodlust. Using such a giant cooldown on a single pack or maybe like an easy 2-pull is pretty wasteful. You want to be doubling or tripling up on your pulls when you use Ashen, or pulling trash onto a boss, or doing something that really takes advantage of just how much damage you're going to get out of it. And that means that your group's going to kind of need to be prepared for that too. They need to be prepared to interrupt for 2 or 3 packs, or heal worth 2 or 3 packs, use defensive cooldowns and health potions to compensate for the extra damage. You get it. Let's move on to Kyrian now, who are definitely the more Mythic Plus oriented Covenant option for Prot Pallies, and the less weird one of the two. Divine Toll really doesn't have much value at all in single target. It basically just becomes a 1-minute cooldown Avenger's Shield. It's capped at 5 targets in terms of effectiveness, so it's a much less playstyle altering choice than Venthyr Pally. And I think there's good and bad in that. It's certainly easier to use and plan around. If you go Kyrian, you basically just treat Mythic Plus the normal way you would on any other tank, except you have a 5-target silence on a 1-minute cooldown. So it's very good. Don't let me seem like I'm underselling it. The utility of being able to effectively AoE silence a group of caster mobs is amazing. The instant 5 holy power you get out of using it in a 5-target pack is amazing. The shielding you get if you're running First Avenger, also amazing. But ultimately, after you've played around with Ashen Hallow, Divine Toll feels like a lot smaller and less gameplay altering of a bonus. In general, I would say that Kyrian is a better covenant for players who are more focused on Mythic Plus. It's more consistent, the defensive value is easier to apply, and it generally provides better group utility than Venthyr that doesn't require as much working around from the rest of your group. The damage is weaker, there's no contest there, but Kyrian Pally damage is still very decent. It's simpler, it's safer, and for necrotic weeks, having that Kyrian potion to easily clear off necrotic stacks is very nice. Okay, let's jump into Soulbinds real quickly. For Venthyr, I feel like you have two good options. Technically, you have three, but let's say two. Theotar has been the go-to option for maximizing DPS thus far in Shadowlands, and despite some of the newest sims and some of the newest feedback from players putting him behind the other two options, that's because his new End of Tree trait, which grants 3% of a random stat, isn't being factored into sims. He's still got a ton of randomness, not only from his new T consumable, but also just from his classic top of the tree umbrella trait. If you're forced to move while that's up, it really cuts into Theotar's value. But if you're able to stand still or you have more controlled and predictable movement, he's going to be your best offensive option. Again, if you're looking for an offensive option and you are being forced to move around, Naja is okay. The alternative to Theotar, in my mind, is General Draven. He's an excellent defensive option. I would argue the best defensive soulbind for every tank. Even the classes like Monk, who would never want to play Venthyr, he's still a great soulbind. His offensive value is actually pretty competitive if you're able to reach all the way to the bottom of the tree. It's more consistent but less bursty, and that's not as good for maximizing your damage and trying to get like a number one parse. But again, it's more reliable defensively, so he's a great choice. I would say he's the Mythic Plus choice, and Theotar is more of the raid choice. Again, Naja's good. She offers a lot of stat budget, and she's comparable to Theotar. She's a bit more of a middle ground option to me, and so I generally prefer to either swing for the fences offensively or really maximize defense and try not to split the difference, but that's up to you. For Kyrian, you also have two good options. Pelagos is a standard defensive choice. He just adds a lot of stat budget and is very good and consistent. Mechanicos is a more offensive choice. He doesn't give much defensive value until you get deep into the tree, but once you get to the very end, he adds a lot of damage and cooldown reduction onto Divine Toll, which is just a great all-around boost in its value. Having a 40-second cooldown on Divine Toll instead of a 60-second cooldown is a big AoE damage increase, utility increase, defensive increase, you get it. It really helps the class a lot with dealing more consistent burst damage in Mythic Plus pools, and having your best offensive ability available a lot more often just makes the class feel more fun. Alright, now let's move on to Conduits. Prot Pallies kind of have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to their potency conduits. Unlike most of the tank classes who maybe have one good option, maybe zero, Pallies are kind of overflowing with them. If you're Venthyr, Hallowed Discernment is your best potency conduit. There's really no question there. Punish the Guilty is your second best option as Venthyr, or your best as Kyrian. Ringing Clarity is your second best option if you're Kyrian, you know, pretty simple. And then as you pick up a third potency conduit slot, Vengeful Shock is going to be the best option there, regardless of which covenant you're playing. Patch 9.1 has added Adaptive Armor Fragment to all tank specs, and it is actually a pretty good conduit for some of the other classes, but again, the baseline for Prot Pally potency conduits is just so high that it's really never worth wearing as a Pally. The class just has too many other good options available for this one to be competitive. Pally's endurance conduit options are also pretty good. Resolute Defender is amazing, one of the best endurance conduits in the game. It substantially increases the uptime of Ardent Defender, and that's excellent. I mean, this is like two bonuses for the price of one. Extra duration and cooldown reduction, it's just amazing. Shielding Words is also really good. I don't know why, but that sentence is a real tongue twister. I had to re-record it like 3 times. Anyways, Shielding Words grants a shield worth a decent portion of Word of Glory's healing, and that really helps with Paladin's self-healing, which kind of comes in really big bursts. You know, it's very large chunks of self-healing, but they're very sporadic. So getting more value out of each time you have to spend a GCD casting Word of Glory is a really nice bonus in my eyes. And lastly, Royal Decree is a good defensive option as well. I would say it's a third place option for Mythic Plus, and depending on fight specifics, maybe a second best place choice for raids, but probably number 3 there as well. It shaves some of Guardian of Ancient Kings cooldown away, and more importantly makes it give you a free Word of Glory when you use Guardian of Ancient Kings, which is great. Getting free, controllable heals when you're taking lots of damage is really valuable. Patch 9.1 added Condensed Animosphere, and the amount of self-healing it provides is very small. I was corrected by somebody in the comments section who said, rightly, that it's actually 10 times larger than what it says in the tooltip, but that's actually still very small. It's only worth about 200 or 300 HPS, which is not terrible, but it's not great either. The other conduits are very forgettable. And finally, Finesse Conduits. Light's Barding adds a ton of extra duration on a Divine Steve, which really helps with Pally's otherwise very bad mobility. Echoing Blessings adds a small bit of extra value onto your blessing skills, which is fine. I would say it's a pretty small bonus and probably not ever worth giving up a potency or finesse conduit to get, unless you're feeling like you're forced through a finesse conduit by the tree that you're using, and you just don't have to move at all, so Light's Barding would be useless. Again, whatever. The other conduits, finesse conduits, are worthless. Next up is Legendaries, and there's only 3 pieces I really need to talk about here, but I will give special mention to a couple of others before I'm done. But first, Domination Sockets don't make Legendaries in the helm, shoulders, chest, bracers, and glove slots. The first Legendary is Mad Paragon. It's the best raid Legendary, it's an incredible DPS Legendary, it synergizes particularly well with Ashen Hallow, it's just a humongous damage increase, especially in single target. There's not a lot more to say about it. Very good damage choice. Next is Bulwark of Righteous Fury, which is a much more consistent AoE DPS option, and I would say it's generally the right choice in Mythic Plus. Again, like Mad Paragon, and even more than Mad Paragon, it's just a DPS choice. But that's okay. It adds a ton of damage. If your Kyrian Divine Resonance is a new Covenant-specific legendary added in patch 9.1, and it really blows away the competition for Mythic Plus and AoE fights. It does exactly what it looks like. After you cast Divine Toll, you cast an extra Avenger Shield every 5 seconds for the next 30 seconds. It just casts 1, starting on your primary target and bouncing around, but that's great. If you're running Mechanicos, and I really think you should be in this setup, you're basically getting 75% uptime on this bonus in AoE. It's really, really good. Just a huge passive increase to your damage, defense, and utility. It's great. Now, all of these options are really simple, and the first 2 are purely damage output oriented. And that's generally all you need, but I do feel like I would be negligent if I didn't at least mention some other alternatives. Holy Avenger's Engraved Sigil is nowhere near Divine Resonance for Kyrian players, but for Venthyr, it's an okay offense and defense hybrid option that will boost your Avenger's Shield usage rate pretty nicely. It's useful in Mythic Plus and definitely a good option for boosting your defense, but I think the biggest value that Paladin has is its offensive potential. And that's really the most important thing I want to emphasize in this whole section is, unlike other tanks, where you can trade defense to gain offense, you're usually trading a very substantial amount of defense to gain a very minor amount of offense. The exact opposite is the case with Paladin. You're trading some defense, you know, how much is a subject for debate, I guess, but generally less defense, and you are gaining potentially gargantuan offensive output from that. Yeah. You're just sacrificing a lot of that value in Mythic Plus or AoE if you're not running Bulwark of Righteous Fury if you're Venthyr, or Divine Resonance if you're Kyrian. The Magistrate's Judgment is another legendary that offers a good blend of offense, although it's clearly more of a single target option, and it's kind of behind the rest of the pack quite a bit. Again, I think if you're using a defensive legendary in raids, you're kind of just missing the point of playing a Pally to begin with. But if you're stuck in a situation where you're on a Pally, it's your best character, and you really need the defense, this is the best choice available. And finally, just to be thorough, Radiant Embers is the new Venthyr legendary added in patch 9.1. It is strictly worse for raid DPS than Mad Paragon, and the only reason I'm mentioning it is to say that, but it is useful as a piece you can put on, cast Ashen Hollow, and then switch off as part of a pre-pull ritual. You will get the extra duration for your opening Ashen Hollow, at least as of the last time I tested it. It's annoying, but at least for now, that's a meaningful DPS increase. Very annoying, though. All right, now let's move on to talents. Paladins have several talent setups that work well for them. I'll put what I consider the best Mythic Plus and Raid setups right on the screen right now, with Mythic Plus on the left and Raid on the right. There's a lot of flexibility here. You have several opportunities to trade damage reduction for damage output, and vice versa, and you have some tiers where it's just simply use this for AoE and this for single target, and you have some tiers where nothing ever changes. So let's start with the first tier. All three options are good in the right situation. Holy Shield is a great passive damage reduction option. It's really good at smoothing out your damage intake, especially when dealing with spells or spell damage over time, which is great for surviving hard-hitting raid content and stuff like Denathrius and Sylvanas, and that's good. It is also boring and weak offensively, so for anything where you don't absolutely need it to live or be comfortable defensively, you probably shouldn't use it. Redoubt is a really simple strength and stamina increase, and just due to the way that damage scales for the class, it's always the best option for maximizing your damage output in raids. It's easy to maintain and pretty boring. I would say it's really just a parsing talent. Blessed Hammer is a great third option, and it's definitely the most fun of the three options in this tier, which makes sense as it's the only one that really has a direct effect on your playstyle. The damage reduction it provides is fine. It's generally a minor step down from Holy Shield in terms of defensive value and quite a bit less consistent, but it lets you generate more holy power during a fight and gives you the ability to generate holy power even when you're not near an enemy, which is a big deal. This is useful in a couple of ways. It's good for getting resources up during an intermission, or if you're having to move away from a boss and then back into melee range, which happens a lot. And it's also useful in between pulls in Mythic Plus. It's also useful as part of pre-pull rituals and raids when you're really trying to max your damage. Pulling a boss resets your holy power to 1, so what you have to do is generate at least 3 holy power with Blessed Hammer, wait for all 3 charges of Blessed Hammer to cool down, then switch to Redoubt, cast Seraphim just before you pull the boss, then cast Ashen Hollow, Taunt, and Avenging Wrath as the pull starts. Alright, so that's tier 1, and it's the most complicated one, I think. Tier 2 is a lot simpler. You just use Crusader's Judgment for single target, and First Avenger for AoE. I like the Crusader's Judgment playstyle more, even in AoE. I think it's a lot more fun, but the shielding and damage of First Avenger is terrific in Mythic Plus, and it really synergizes nicely with either Bulwark of Righteous Fury if you're Venthyr, or Divine Resonance if you're Kyrian, so it's a must-have in Mythic Plus. Cavalier is good if you really need extra movement, or you just simply don't need extra defensive power. I really like it in Torghast, for example. With a decent Torghast power setup, I can get over 50% Divine Steve uptime, and that's, well, it's not fun, but it's alright. Blessing of Spell Warding can be extremely useful on raid bosses where there's some sort of fancy spell damage mechanic, and unlike Blessing of Protection or Divine Shield, it doesn't cause the target to drop threat. It was really good in Phase 2 Denathrius, for example, because it prevented his Racking Pain debuff from applying. For fights where you don't really have that kind of mechanic you can ignore with spell warding, it's basically worthless, and that is most fights. It's a very case-by-case basis kind of talent. Unbreakable Spirit is the just general default defensive option, and it's very good. The next tier is a choice between Divine Purpose and Seraphim. Seraphim's a great DPS talent, and it does function as sort of a defensive cooldown against magic damage, I guess, but it's definitely weaker against physical damage than simply having higher Shield of the Righteous uptime. And it does actually lower your Shield of the Righteous uptime, even just compared to having no talent, because you're spending a full Shield of the Righteous every 45 seconds on Seraphim instead. Basically, for Mythic Plus, I would always recommend Divine Purpose unless you're not worried about your incoming damage at all. So, for tyrannical weeks, or weeks with really easy affixes, or if you just feel like you really overgear the key, I think you could justify Seraphim if you're feeling brave. And the same goes for raid fights too. If you're not feeling threatened by the content and you really want to do a lot of damage, Seraphim is great if you use it consistently and you make an effort to line it up with Avenging Wrath and Ashen Hallow. The cooldown doesn't line up with the baseline Divine Toll, although if you're using Mechanicos and you have his full tree unlocked, it actually is very close, and there's decent synergy there, I guess. Divine Purpose is very simple, it's just very good defensively, it adds a ton of Shield of the Righteous uptime, and that's great. It is actually a decent damage increase on its own. It's really only considered an inferior offensive option because of how terrific Seraphim is at lining up with all your other cooldowns. I mean, Divine Purpose is totally awesome as a default talent, and Seraphim is just very useful if you really want to put out some damage. It's just situational. Consecrated Ground is the best choice in Mythic Plus because it helps with kiting, and it makes staying in Consecrate much easier even while you're moving around. Judgment of Light adds a ton of passive raid healing, so you really should always use it in raids. It's a great option. Hand of the Protector, that's a whole utility playstyle that I don't really think's worth the effort or the sacrifice. There are some situations where it can be useful. It's part of the Sun King's Salvation Prot healing Pally setup that can do seriously like tens of thousands of HPS to Kel'Thas, but that's not relevant anymore, and whatever, who cares, it's boring anyways. Healing? No thank you. And finally, in the last tier, you really have two choices on how you want to approach your wings. Sanctified Wrath makes wings a much stronger cooldown while it's active, and increases its uptime by 25%, whereas Righteous Protector basically reduces its cooldown by 50%, which doubles its uptime. In general, I think Righteous Protector is the more useful talent. For Mythic Plus, I think it's basically always the right choice. For normal raids where you aren't feeling super confident about the fight duration, or if you know it's going to be an inconvenient fight time like 5 minutes and 50 seconds, so that the boss dies right when Wings is about to come up for another usage, I think it's the better choice. There are times where Sanctified Wrath can be a better option than raids, but you need specific fight timings like a 4 minute and 30 second fight would be perfect. Basically, you need to be able to get full power out of every usage of Avenging Wrath, and I would say you really need to be getting extra Avenging Wrath uptime from people dying in range of you running Retribution Aura as well. So it's good for carry runs, or LFR, I guess. When in doubt, Righteous Protector is the best choice here. And before I move on, Final Stand is a pretty commonly used talent in the last tier for Mythic Plus, and while I liked it back in BFA when it was in a different tier and up against much less competitive options, I kind of think it's a trap talent now. Being able to have Wings up twice as often is insanely valuable, and more valuable, I think, than being able to Bubble Taunt every 5 minutes. There's no question that Bubble Taunt is a useful skill. There are a good number of people making decent use out of it, and being able to totally immune damage and still hold on to threat is really good. It just doesn't mesh into everything else I think about when I think about Paladin. It's a very damage first, high utility, low mobility class, and giving up a ton of damage output for a great defensive cooldown just really doesn't sit right with me. I think if you're willing to give up a bunch of damage to be more tanky, you probably would be better off just playing Demon Hunter or Warrior or even Druid. The Prot Paladin rotation, despite how much damage it's capable of doing, is actually pretty easy. You should always use your cooldowns as much as possible unless you're holding them for a specific reason, like an ad spawn or an extra damage phase. The only thing that changes in AoE is that Avenger's Shield jumps up in value ahead of Judgment, but otherwise everything else stays the same. You always want to be standing in Consecration at all times while you're tanking. You get a ton of damage reduction passively just by staying in that Consecration, so if you have to move out of it, which happens a lot, you'll want to recast it as soon as you have stopped moving. Maintaining Shield of the Righteous is pretty much the key to staying tanky as a Paladin, and it deals a good amount of damage too. You can use Word of Glory when it's free, which happens every 5 times you cast Shield of the Righteous, but you really shouldn't ever be spending Holy Power to hard cast Word of Glory. It's almost never worth it unless it's the only thing that would save your life and you've exhausted every single other avenue of defense, like health pots, health stones, divine shield, ardent defender, lay on hands, external cooldowns, all of that. If it's all gone, then sure, Word of Glory yourself. Before I move on to stats, I guess I'll just mention auras and say, remember to switch out of Crusader aura before you start tanking. Devotion aura is kind of the normal go-to defensive option, but if you think people around you are gonna die, Retribution aura will give you those wings. Alright, now let's move on to stats. The basic stat priority for Protection Paladin is pretty much the same as it has been in the past couple of expansions. Haste is the most important stat, you want as much as you can get. Versatility is good and very consistent, it's also great secondary stat. Mastery is good, but gives you less offensive value than versatility, and so I would say it's a little behind versatility, but very comparable. Crit's an outstanding offensive stat, but very unreliable defensively. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are sockets and item level. Actually, not in that order. Item level, then sockets, then haste, and then the rest of the stats don't really matter. Lightless Force is the best weapon enchant for dealing damage in AoE, but unlike the other tanks, Paladins do enough single target damage to actually justify using Sinful Revelation in pure single target. Technically, it's a single target DPS increase for all tanks, but Paladins are the only one where they do enough damage that you're actually going to be able to notice. As far as trinkets go, there are some decent ones from dungeons and raids, and I'd like to just highlight the best options. Phial of Putrefaction from Plaguefall is a simple single target DPS increase from Mythic Plus. It's very, very nice and totally passive. Inscrutable Quantum Device from The Other Side adds an enormous amount of damage when lined up with every Ashen Hallow cast, and it's a really good trinket for maximizing your burst damage potential, like insanely good in both single target and AoE. The best defensive trinket from Mythic Plus is Blood Spattered Scale, which is also from The Other Side. It's an excellent defensive trinket that still offers a decent chunk of damage output. None of the trinkets from Tazavesh, the new Mega Dungeon, seem all that impressive, but Solea's Secret Technique is a pretty good secondary stat buff trinket while you're gearing up. The best trinkets from Castle Nathria are Dreadfire Vessel from Sire Denathrius, and Stone Legion Heraldry from the Stone Legion Generals. Splintered Heart of Alar from Sun King is an okay cheat death trinket if you find yourself in need of a cheat death trinket. Most of the new trinkets from the Sanctum of Domination raid are, well, I was gonna say they're not all that special, but there are actually a couple that are very special. First, Old Warrior's Soul. It's special. It drops off of Sylvanas and it provides just a gargantuan amount of haste that slowly stacks up over the first minute and 40 seconds of a fight and just stays up permanently. When you drop combat, it turns into a 15-second buff, so you still have some time to get into your next pull before it falls off. It's amazing. Best trinket I've ever seen. Whispering Shard of Power was nerfed since I put out my warrior video, and I suspect it's no longer very good. Perhaps its proc rate was buffed to compensate, but I don't know that yet. It's flagged as a DPS only trinket, so you would need to set your loot spec to Retribution to get it anyhow. I tested it a lot on the PTR, and it just seemed to spawn a little ad that I had to tab target to and auto attack to get a big haste buff. That seemed pretty decent pre-nerf, but a lot less reliable than old Warrior's Soul. Additionally, and this is anecdotal, I heard from several other people that when they tested it, the proc rate was like 1 every 3 minutes. Like, it was insanely low proc rate, like unreasonably low proc rate. That wasn't my experience at all. I found it to be just like a normal 1 proc per minute, regular haste proc trinket, you know, fine, weird little tab target auto attack thing, but otherwise very normal. I don't know, maybe it's changed post nerf. Maybe they've upped the proc rate. Maybe I was beating the odds in the past. I don't know. I guess we'll see. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis from the 9 isn't a huge defensive boost, but it does seem like it can deal a pretty good burst of AoE damage in Mythic Plus, or on some of the AoE fights in this raid. Decanter of Endless Howling from Soul Render Dormazane seems good on paper, but and again, this is anecdotal, found its proc rate to be pretty low during testing. I would say it has very good potential to be a great trinket, but, you know, buyer beware. Reactive Defensive Matrix from Guardian of the First Ones is actually a pretty interesting trinket design. You know, proccing a shield from taking damage, that's kind of boring, but proccing a damage reflection from taking damage, not bad. But I think you'd need to be consistently tanking to really good value out of it, and because Sanctum of Domination's fights are pretty much all taunt swap encounters, that really cuts its value basically in half. I would say this seems bad in Raid, but in Mythic Plus could probably be pretty good. Weave of Warped Fates is a weird cheat death trinket that gives you control over when you decide to come back to life after you die. I just don't like it. It's sort of like a free soul stone or an ancestral protection totem. I think I got the name of that right. Yeah, I don't like it. I don't like coming back to life without threat. No thanks. And lastly, I'll just talk briefly about special weapons in the raid. Unlike the 3 agility tanks, Paladins and Warriors don't get anything with a unique special damage proc or some kind of on-use effect. Instead, they just get higher item level weapons than those tanks have available. Kel'Thuzad and Sylvanas drop weapons and shields for the 3 strength tanks, and nothing in the weapon slots for agility tanks. Given that I expect to spend more time on agility tanks and strength tanks in the coming month or so of raid, I have to say I hate it. It sucks. But oh well. It's good news for everybody who loves and mains strength tanks. Oh well. Patch 9.1 is here, and it's brought a lot of new interesting stuff. Protection Paladins, like all of the tanks, are in a pretty good competitive spot right now. Unlike pretty much all the rest of the tanks, they have incredible damage output. They have amazing group utility, and despite those strengths, they're still reasonably tanky. I think they're in a great spot. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Protection Paladins and Shadowlands Patch 9.1, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye.